Hi friends, this is the full-length explanation of measuring angles in radians. So radian measure is another way to measure angles. We're familiar with degrees. We've been measuring angles in degrees since we were in elementary school. Radians is simply another unit, like going from Fahrenheit to Celsius or from inches to meters. We're just measuring angles in another unit. They're measured very fundamentally differently. When we measure angles in degrees, we're measuring at the pointy part of the angle and saying like, how pointy is it? When we're measuring the radian measure of an angle, what we're actually asking is, how much of this circle does my angle cut off? And if it's a wider angle, it will cut off more of the circle. If it's a smaller angle, it will cut off a smaller amount of the circle. And let's skip ahead to this picture. So for example, if I had a circle of radius 1, then radian 1 angle would be the angle that cuts off an arc length of 1. If I have an arc length of 1, regardless of where it is, maybe my arc length of 1 is over here. If this length is 1, then this angle is measured to be 1 radian. Right? So let's examine what the radian measure is of some familiar angles, and then we'll be able to convert them as fractions. You're going to report these as multiples of pi, but let's begin at the beginning. What is the radian measure of 90 degrees? So now, you know what? I'm not even going to put the axes there. We're just going to draw a circle and say, what happens if I put a 90-degree angle in this circle somewhere? And the circle has radius 1. We're always looking at a circle of radius 1. That's the unit part of the word unit circle, a 1-unit radius circle. And my question is, what is the length of this arc? Because that's how we report radian measure. Now, you probably remember that the whole circumference of the circle would be 2 pi r. And since the radius is 1, that would be 2 pi times 1, which is 2 pi. And I notice that this part of the circle I'm looking at right here is 1/4 of that. So 1/4 of 2 pi, which would be pi, 1/2 pi, or I would say pi halves or pi over 2. That would be the radian measure of my angle. That's the amount, that's the length of the arc that is cut off, pi halves or pi over 2. We're going to jump down here to 180. On the same picture, I can imagine if I cut off an angle that was 180 degrees, you notice how that's half of the circle? So that would be 1/2 of 2 pi, which is conveniently just pi. If you want to know a fun secret, the Greeks got pi wrong. The Greeks, the way pi was defined was the ratio of the circumference to the diameter of any circle. But the diameter is not the fundamental measure of a circle. The radius is the fundamental measure of the circle. If the Greeks had defined pi to be the circumference divided by the radius, then the number we call pi would actually be the full circumference of the circle, and that would make all these calculations easier. If you feel like these calculations are a little bit wonky, you're not alone. But just squirrel that piece of information away for some other time. And you can sound smart, bring it up the next time you're talking to your math teacher. Anyway, the easiest conversion factor, if you like using conversions, you can remember that 180 degrees is exactly pi radians. So that's a handy conversion factor if you want to use it that way. But rather than just memorize it, let's understand this a little bit. Okay, so here, this would be the thing that you have to memorize if you want to memorize all of your famous angles on the unit circle as radians. The better thing is to not think of angles in degrees and convert them to radians, but rather to understand that from here to here, on the unit circle is pi radians, and measure everything else in fractions of that. So for example, 90 degrees, we already know is 1/2. It's pi halves, pi over 2, because it's 1/2 of that whole pi distance. If I looked at this one right here, you might notice, well, that distance is 1/3 of the way over to pi, so that one's pi thirds, or pi over 3. This guy here, he's 1/4 of the way. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's pi fourths. And I would recommend that you look at these angles. If you're doing unit circle stuff in trigonometry and pre-calc, whatever class you're in, you're looking at these angles and you're asked to find, like, what's the radian measure of this thing over here. Don't try and find the degrees and convert it. Just say, all right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is 5 out of 6 segments to pi. 5/6 pi. And that will